Oh, that's hot coffee. I've been into cold brew all summer, making it. Love it, try it, but that's some hot espresso. So the Psalms are, of course, beautiful for what they say, the way that they are brutally honest about our experience of the world and the divine. But the Psalms are also beautiful for what they don't say. Because the Psalms have this really unique ability to remind us of the significance of metaphor. That metaphor is not just this interesting addition, that poetry is this neat little add-on to how we speak about the divine. Metaphor is actually the primary way that we speak about anything that's important to us. And this is something that I think oftentimes we forget in the Christian tradition. We feel like literal is better, but metaphorical or literary is somehow ancillary, and that's just not the case. Look at some of our most important language in Christianity. We call Jesus the Son of God. But son and father imply a particular type of relationship, if we want to take them literally. They imply the idea that there was a time when the father was, and then the father somehow procreated, and Jesus became. In fact, that's actually one of the oldest heresies in the Christian tradition. We call it Arianism. It comes from a guy named Arius who said there was a time when he was not, meaning that Jesus is a created being that comes from the Father. And Christianity rejected that idea. They said, no, Jesus is not literally a son, an offspring of the Father. Son and Father indicate a type of relationship, an intimacy that exists between the Godhead. Jesus is not literally a son. God is not literally a father. It's more than that. It's a metaphor that speaks to something more true. I think of my relationship with my son. My son is adopted, and every once in a while someone will ask me, well, who is his real father? And I want to say, no, I am his real father. I'm just not literally his father in that biological sense that you're thinking of. My relationship to my son is so much more important than just the literal meaning of those words, and that goes for everything in the Christian story. All of our language speaks to something that outstrips the ability of words to communicate. We are speaking about the divine. We are speaking about things that are fundamentally outside the scope of our ability to grasp and communicate. And so all of our language, at some sense, becomes metaphorical. And that's where it really becomes real for us. I mean, the Psalms call God a rock and a fortress, a hiding place. And all of those things are far more important to me than believing that God is omniscient or omnipresent or omnipotent. I mean, those words might be literally true in some sense, but they're not particularly meaningful to me in the real life. What's meaningful to me is the metaphors, the way that I speak, the way that I experience, the way that I communicate my encounter and my relationship with the divine. The Psalms remind us of that in fact the most important ways we speak of our experience of God are the metaphors, the similes, the analogies we use from our experience of the world, and we extrapolate that out when it comes to spirit. In fact, everything about Christian theology is metaphor. There is nothing in what we talk about that is fully able to capture the divine, and so everything that we say is always provisional. One of the ways that I like to talk about this is to remind myself that all theology is useful illusion. None of it, nothing that I ever say about God is factually, literally true about the divine, because it is always drawn from my experience of being a human. None of it captures God in God's essence. So it's always provisional, it's always an illusion, but it can be useful in terms of helping me make sense of God. The problem is when I start to think that the way I speak about God, the language I give to God, the language that I incorporate into my experience of God, even from the scriptures, actually contains God. Then it becomes not particularly useful. It becomes constraining. It becomes constricting. It actually closes off my ability to experience God in all the breadth that God comes to me through. The Psalms remind us of all of that, because they choose to speak of God in ways that are big and bold and so far beyond our ability of language to be locked down into literal meaning. And here's what I hope you get from the Psalms this summer. This reminder that literal is actually the least significant way that we can speak of something as big as God. Because literal will always be drawn from our immediate experience of this world in this space and our perception of it. Metaphor, simile, analogy, words that begin to point not at God, but to God, toward God. This is actually what calls us to continually expand our imagination and actually draws us closer to the experience of the infinite divine that interacts with us every day. Literal is fine as far as it goes. Literary, this is what will actually help you to encounter spirit in your life in this moment right now. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that literal, concrete language is somehow more spiritual. It's not. It's actually the baseline, lowest level you can use to speak about God. Beauty, poetry, metaphor, simile, analogy, all of these will usher you much closer into the space that God occupies.